topic of conversation was from John chapter 13, verses 18 through 30. And what was the big word that I kept throwing out there over and over and over again? Betrayal. Well, I know who listened this morning. But I said it over and over again. Or again. No. Well, betray. Oh, it's 3 syllables. It's 3 syllables. Come on. Betrayal. No. Okay. What is the definition of betrayal? What has to be present for betrayal to exist? A close relationship. What else? Formal or informal. A close relationship there, yeah. What else? Okay, breach of trust. Know the person. You have to know the person. There has to be a closeness. There has to be an intimacy. And what does that person have to do? Turn on you? Do something against you? Hurt you somehow? Now, whatever it is that they do when they're against you or they hurt you somehow, is that just anything that may accidentally happen? It has to be intentional. Somebody has to intentionally hurt you with malice aforethought, so to speak, deliberately, and that person has to be close enough that you trust that there's a breach of trust there. Apart from Judas betraying Jesus, or Brutus betraying Julius Caesar, what is another example of betrayal? I'm sorry, Mary? Okay. Okay. Judas and Jesus. Yeah, Joseph's brothers. They turned on him. He got sick up and fed with all of his dreams that he enjoyed and for tattling on them and everything else. And so they turned on him. They sold him. Well, as we are moving forward, what's the last thing that we talked about last week regarding the book of Kings? He got hit with an attack of the stupids. Yep. And so, as a result of that, the kingdom divided into 2. Starting with 1 Kings chapter 17, which is where we're starting tonight, going on through, all the way through 2 Kings chapter 13, verse 25. That's a lot of chapters. There's something that I would refer to as the Prophetic Revolt. How is a revolution or a revolt, a coup, different from betrayal?
Is a coup usually with the army?
A coup is usually with the army, and they try to overthrow whoever the commander, and whoever the king, whoever the emperor, something like that is. How is this different?
When Judas
deals with politics.
When Judas did it, like it was for personal gain, and in the other situation, it's like for a leader and his people to overcome.
Okay. Back in the book of Genesis, and as more so in Exodus and Leviticus and Numbers and Deuteronomy, who was the prophet that Israel looked to?
Genesis?
Well, in the Pentateuch, the first 5 books. Moses. And wasn't there a prophecy that there was going to be a prophet like Moses? Who was the main prophet that we see in the book of Samuel? Samuel. Yeah. What do Moses and Samuel have in common? Relationship with God. What else? in a nutshell, at this point, with Samuel and with Moses both, not only was the man a prophet, but he was also a religious leader for the entire nation. He was also a political / military leader for the entire nation. So he's got all of the human stuff, political and military, on his plate, as well as all the divine spiritual stuff on his plate. That separated whenever Samuel anointed Saul to be king. Now all the political military stuff is on the king's plate. All the spiritual stuff is on the prophet's plate. So what role, after Samuel anointed Saul, did the prophet have in the life of Israel? They were advisors to the king. We see David with advisors. We see the various king being advisors. They are still there. They're still consulting the kings in order to help Israel. How do the prophets revolt?
They're not advising the king.
Not only are they not advising the king anymore, they're actually prophesying against the king. So this is a pretty seminal shift in the role that prophets have. Up to this point, prophets have either been the rulers, period, end of sentence, or they have been advisors to the political / military rulers. And when we turn to 1 Kings chapter 17, prophets take on a brand new role. They are now in the face of the king, if you will. So we'll look at this. A prophet spoke for the Lord, Yahweh, okay? Moses and Samuel were political leaders. Later, after Samuel anointed Saul, Samuel is an advisor. Nathan with David is an advisor. And this changed. With the moral religious decline, prophets became preachers who denounced kings and royal policies. The one who spoke to kings now speaks against the kings. Why did they suddenly turn? Well, it says right here, with moral religious decline, why did they turn against kings?
Because of the idols they started worshiping.
Yeah. Who fostered that moral and religious decline? The kings turned against God. And so now, for the first time in the history of Israel, the prophets are no longer supporting the leadership of the country, because the leadership of the country is wandering away from God. And that's why whenever we get to this section, it can be referred to as the Prophetic Revolt. This material is not prophetic only. Remember, we talked, how many kings were there in the northern kingdom? In the southern kingdom? And how many good kings in the northern kingdom? Zero. How many good kings in the southern kingdom? Okay. And what was the story of the kings? What was the little pattern that they used for telling the story of every king? Well, that was the litmus test at the end of it all, but the nature of his succession, how he became king, how long he ruled, and an evaluation whether he is a good king or a bad king. And all the kings in Judah, who are they held up to? David. And if they did like David, they're a good king. And the kings in the northern kingdom, who are they held up to? Jeroboam. And it's hard to imagine anybody worse than Jeroboam, but there is one king who was worse than Jeroboam. He was a piece of work. So when we get to this material, it's not prophetic material only, but there are 2 or 3 major prophets, and there's a lot of material is devoted to those major prophets, and these major prophets are in relationship to the kings as they continue to narrate the history of the nation. But now we see the prophets coming in. There are 3 non-writing prophets that we read about that happened early on here: Elijah, Elisha, and Micaiah. If I would have said Elijah and Elisha, everybody said, well, I know those 2. Who is Micaiah? We'll find out in a little bit. There were some writing prophets about this time, just a little bit later, not the same time frame as Elijah, Elisha, Micaiah, and that would be Amos and Hosea, and we have their books, and they prophesied to and against the northern kingdom of Israel. Isaiah and Micah prophesied to and against the southern kingdom of Judah. So as we look at all of this, it all starts with Elijah, and in 1 Kings chapter 17, it right out of the gate, we read about Ahab reigning in Israel, and he talks about what's happening with Ahab, who is a member of the Omride dynasty, and without any prelude, without anything, chapter 17, verse 1, now Elijah the Tishbite of Tishbe in Gilead said to Ahab, as the Lord, the God of Israel lives, before whom I stand, there shall be neither dew nor rain these years, except by my word. And the word of the Lord came to him, depart from here, turn eastward, hide yourself by the brook Kerith, which is east of the Jordan. You shall drink from the brook, and I have commanded the ravens to feed you there. So he went and did according to the word of the Lord. He went and lived by the brook Kerith, that is east of the Jordan. And the ravens brought him bread and meat in the morning, and bread and meat in the evening, and he drank from the brook. And after a while the brook dried up, because there was no rain in the land. All of this is taking place during the reign of Ahab. 75 years, roughly, give or take, has passed since the Israeli Civil War, since Israel was divided up into two kingdoms, the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah. We have Rehoboam in the south, we have Jeroboam in the north. Jeroboam is done. The Omride dynasty is the dynasty in power at this particular point in time. Ahab, if you prefer, is the king at this particular point in time. So we're looking somewhere around, what does it say? 855 BC, something about that time frame. Whenever we see Amos and Hosea and Isaiah and Micah, it's about 50 years further down. Politically speaking, like I said, in the Omride dynasty, Ahab and Ahaziah were the kings in Israel, overlapping Elijah, because Elijah prophesied against both of them. And Jehoshaphat was the king in Judah. We could say that this was a time of royal paganism, state-supported idolatry. What did God say? Thou shalt have one or two other gods in addition to me? No other gods. And Ahab, brilliant man that he is, made Baal worship, the official religion of the northern kingdom. And once he made Baal worship the official religion of the northern kingdom, Elijah comes forward. The prophetic revolt has begun. The real issue is, who is God, Yahweh or Baal? We know that, but it's not unlike the question that was settled with the 10 plagues, is it? Who is God, Yahweh or the Egyptian pantheon? Well, the Egyptian pantheon couldn't stand before Yahweh. All the plagues were an attack against some fashion or some form of Egyptian religious worship. And so now, and if there's one thing that will characterize Elijah's role as a prophet, is his battle against Baal. So, the problem began when Ahab did not marry well. He married the daughter of a king from another kingdom altogether. The man's name was Ethbaal. He was king of Sidon, and Ahab married his daughter, the lovely little girl named... How many of you know girls born today who are named Jezebel? How many of you know little boys named Judas? Why would he go and marry Jezebel, a Sidonian princess?
That's the way that they made pacts with different kings. They married their relatives and they were all
Yeah.
out there.
That's how you had alliances with other countries. You intermarried. How many wives did Solomon have? 200. No. How many? 700 wives of noble birth. Political marriages. How many alliances did Solomon enter into? Whew. Yeah, too many. So, why was Jezebel a problem?
She was the most evil woman on earth. It says right here in this Bible.
Yeah. How evil is evil? What was that old from yesteryear? Evil. Well, the first real picture we have of exactly how bad this is, well, I'm looking for it. I can't find it. I probably need to back up a little bit. Let's talk about that. Who is Naboth?
He was the guy who owned the land that backed up to the land of the king.
He owned land that was adjacent to Ahab's land. And what did he have planted on that piece of land? A vineyard. So he's got a grape farm. Okay? And Ahab sees that grape farm, and how does he respond? Yeah, I want it myself. And so he goes to Naboth, and he offers to pay Naboth for. In fact, he offers to give him a better piece of land somewhere else, larger, even more productive. And how does Naboth reply? But why in the world would he turn down something that was so lucrative? A better, bigger piece of land.
Because God had allocated him that land.
He is still relying on the parceling out of the land in the book of Joshua. And this was his allotment from God. So, like any good king would do, Ahab says, well, I appreciate your dignity and I understand your commitment, and so I will leave you be. And he goes on about his business, right?
Now he starts crying. Jezebel.
He goes home. He goes into his room and he pouts. And his wife Jezebel comes in. She sees him pouting. And what does she say to him? Yeah, he's the king. You know, she has grown up in a royal palace. She has grown up seeing how a king acts. Her daddy was king. And here this man that she's married to is not acting very kingly. And so she says, you know what? Don't worry about it. I got it covered. So she goes and persuades Naboth to sell, right?
No.
What does she do? She plots. She writes a letter to the ruler of the town, says, I want y'all to have this incredible party, and I want you to invite everybody, and I want you to make sure that you have two dirty, rotten scoundrels sitting on either side of Naboth. And when the time is right, I want them to stand up and say that they heard Naboth curse God. And I want you all to deal with him. And so they put it into action. It happened. Naboth was killed. She comes back to her husband saying, you can have the vineyard now, honey. Naboth's not going to put up a fight. Elijah confronts Ahab over the deed, and in general terms, he says, you and your wife are done for. In fact, there's something in there to the effect of the dogs will lick up your blood, the same place they licked up Naboth's blood. Not a real pleasant thought. Well, when I say he was going against Baal, the real decision here, everybody is falling in line with Ahab, who is the ruler, the king of the northern kingdom of Israel. Of course, he is being prodded all along by his wife Jezebel. There's a saying that was real popular last century, something along the lines of, who wears the pants in that family? And someone could question who wears the pants in that family between Ahab and Jezebel. But remember, he is opposing Ahab because Ahab is promoting Baal worship. And so he actually goes toe-to-toe with that. And the passage that I read just a little bit ago about it's going to remain dry, and it was dry, and how long was it dry? Yeah, there was a drought, and it all came by the word of Elijah. Now, this tells us a little bit why. Whoops, wrong way. Baal was the fertility god in the area. They believed that Baal brought the rains that helped the crop to grow. And so what we're looking at here is that he brought they worshiped Baal. They wanted a good crop. He brought them bounty, agrarian bounty, and all that sort of stuff. And so Baal worshipers believed that they would, whenever they had a good crop, it was because Baal was smiling upon them. And whenever they had a bad crop, for some reason or another, they had not pleased Baal sufficiently. And so there was a prophet, Elijah. He announced the severe drought. Baal prophets were trying to explain Baal's absence, because evidently he must be absent in all of this. Elijah's taken care of during this time. We read all of that. And then after a few years, 3.5 years, there's a showdown. Come on. There we go. Elijah goes toe-to-toe with the prophets of Baal and prophets of Asherah. Where did this happen? I thought that was a street over off of Scenic. What's the setup here? What's the scene?
Well, all the prophets of Baal were there, and Elijah let them go first, and they had no success of bringing down fire to help them.
Yeah, he says, let's have a little contest. We'll see who is God, Yahweh or Baal. You cut up a cow and you put him on an altar and you call upon Baal to burn him up.
They had to douse them with water.
No, not the prophets of Baal. And how many prophets of Asherah? Because 400 prophets of Asherah and 450 prophets of Baal. You ever felt outnumbered? So he lets them go first, and they go ahead and they prepare their altar, and they go ahead and put the cow on the altar, and they decide to, and they start calling upon Baal. And starting in chapter 18, he sets everything up, verse 23. Let 2 bulls be given. Let them, the prophets of Baal, choose one. They get choice. Cut it into pieces, lay it on the wood, no fire. I will prepare the other bull and lay it on the wood and put no fire. You call upon the name of your God, and I will call upon the name of the Lord. And the God who answers by fire, he is God. And all the people said, okay, you got yourself a deal. So Elijah said, the prophets of Baal, choose for yourself. You prepare it. You are many. You call upon the name of your God, but don't put any fire. So they did all of that in verse 26. And they called upon the name of Baal from morning until noon. Baal, answer us! But there was no voice. No one answered. Well, there's a shock. Limped around the altar that they had. Why were they limping?
It says they leaped.
Yeah, mine says limped. Leaped is probably a better translation, is probably more accurate. They weren't walking steady, is the basic idea of it all. And so it's either leaped or limped, but probably they were dancing is what it's saying. At noon, Elijah mocked them. How dare a man of God mock someone? That's uncalled for. Atrocious. Cry aloud. He is God. Either he is musing or he's relieving himself or he's on a journey or maybe he's asleep and he needs to be awakened. At this time, he's having fun with them. They cried all the louder and they cut themselves. If there's ever a testimony for cutting oneself, be demon related. It's that verse right there. Until blood gushed out, midday passed, they raved on until the time of the oblation offering, and there was no voice, no one answered, no one paid attention. How long has this been going on? 6, 7 hours from the time that they started. They started off really good. They're crying out. They're calling upon him. They're dancing, trying to get his favor, trying to get his attention. And Elijah starts to goad them on just a little bit, and he's starting to tease them and make fun of them. And they're getting more and more desperate, and so they're getting a little bit wilder, and they start cutting themselves, and blood is flowing everywhere. Maybe Baal will be happy with all this. And after about 7 hours of all of this, absolutely nothing. Verse 30. Elijah said to the people, "Come near to me." And all the people came near, and he repaired the altar of the Lord that had been thrown down. Elijah took 12 stones, according to the number of the tribes of the sons of Jacob. With the stones he built an altar in the name of the Lord. And he made a trench about the altar as great as would contain 2 seahs of seed. That's about, if I do the math right, well, it's probably about 14 quarts. It's a little over 3 gallons. A seah is either a dry measure or a liquid measure. In this case, a liquid measure. He put the wood in order, cut the bull in pieces, laid it on the wood. He said, "Fill 4 jars with water and pour it on the burnt offering and on the wood." How much water did they have? It had 3.5-year-long drought. This is about all the water that they may have had. He douses the sacrifice. They fill up the barrels. They douse it again. Water ran around the altar. It filled the trench with water. 3 times he doused all of that. So now you used up water that you could not have afforded to use up in the first place. They've had their say for 7 hours, 6, 7 hours. And now he has thoroughly wetted down everything. And the time of the offering came, and Elijah came near and said, "O Lord, let it be known this day, you are God. Answer me, O Lord, answer me, so that these people may know that you, O Lord, are God." And verse 38, the fire of the Lord fell and consumed the burnt offering and the wood and the stones and the dust and licked up the water that was in the trench till it was all bone dry. People saw it, they fell on their faces, and they said, "The Lord, He is God. The Lord, He is God." And Elijah said, "Seize the prophets of Baal, let no one escape." And they seized them, and they took them to the brook Kishon, and they slaughtered them there. Who's happy? Elijah's probably happy, because Elijah's been mocking them, and now he's put them in their place. Who is not happy? Jezebel, huh? She's not happy. Sorry? Yeah, well, they don't have much say now. Now, the brook Kishon came off of the Mediterranean, and the brook Kerith was east of the Jordan, so there might have been some water in the brook Kishon coming out of the Mediterranean. And Elijah tells Ahab, you better get back into town or the rain's going to catch up with you. Like, it hadn't rained around here in 3.5 years. What are you talking about? And so Elijah goes up on top of a mountain, and his servant comes up there, and he says to his servant, he says, go out and look at the Mediterranean, and then come back and tell me what you see. And so he says, yeah, I did just the Mediterranean. He says, go and look again. And after several times, he comes back and he says, well, there's a teeny tiny little dark cloud about the size of a man's fist. And he says, we better get into town or we're going to be caught in the rain out here. And it says that he hitched up his robe and he ran into town and he passed Ahab in his chariot. How fast was the man running? He caught up. This has been however long. He caught up with the man and passed the man. And they're just, water is coming down in buckets. And so the drought ends. Well, you would think that things were going well. You would think Elijah is happy. You would think that the people had heard the message. You know, everybody's happy except for Ahab and Jezebel, especially Jezebel. And something happens. Elijah flees. Why does Elijah flee? Okay, he just stared down 450 prophets of Baal and 400 prophets of Asherah. 1 against 850. He mocked them. Well, they had swords and lances in their hands because they wound up using them to cut themselves. Why was he afraid of what Jezebel said?
She said she was going to kill all of his prophets or kill him.
It's just one woman, and he stared down 850.
She must be really scary.
Must be really scary. She must be really scary, but I think there's something else here. What happens to people today after they've had a spiritual high? They have a spiritual downer. I would submit to you that after all of this was over with, Elijah was exhausted. What's the difference in our Christian life when we have energy and when we're exhausted? But he must not have been too weak on energy, because where did he flee to? He got to a tree and he took a nap, woke up and there was food and he ate it and went back to sleep, and he woke up and there's food and he ate it and went back. Yeah. Where is that located? Southern end of the country. It's as far south as you could go. Where is Carmel? Just west of the Sea of Galilee, along the Mediterranean coastline. He probably ran 50, 60, 70 miles. He was so exhausted that he didn't have the emotional strength and the spiritual strength to face Jezebel, but he had the physical energy to run as far as he possibly could. He left his servant along the way at the border. He goes all the way down to a mountain. Chapter 19, verse 8. Which mountain? What's Horeb also known as? Sinai. This is where the 10 Commandments were given. This is where Moses was called at the burning bush. This is down in the Sinai wilderness. He had left his servant way back, right at the border. God gets his attention. Let's see if I have it there. No, I don't have it there. How does God get his attention? He talks to him. He asks him a question. What does he ask him?
What are you doing here?
Yeah, exactly. What are you doing down here, Elijah? Well, you just don't understand. I'm the only one that serves you. I'm the only one that is faithful to you. There's nobody else in all the world that is faithful to you, God. And then he stepped foot outside the cave, and what did God show him? An earthquake, a forest fire, mountains trembling. And then God spoke to him in still small voice. And what did he say the second time? Same thing he said the first time. What are you doing here? There's two responses that God gave Elijah at this point. The first response was he reassured Elijah. Elijah was not alone. There were others in the land that had not bowed the knee to Baal, and so they still worshiped him. And so Elijah was not all alone in everything that he was attempting to try to do. The second thing that he did, he gave him a job. How does that help? He wanted him to go and do some more prophesying to specific areas. He wanted to pick up Elisha along the way. Elijah is done. He has done what he could to confront Baal, and it didn't work out, and Jezebel's mad at him. Yet, now he has a job. He has a purpose. God has given him a fresh start on all of this. Well, Ahab dies, Ahaziah becomes king. Ahaziah is injured when he falls in his house. And Ahaziah sends messengers to inquire of who? The god of Ekron, if he's going to survive or not. But what was the god's name? Beelzebub. Okay. And Elijah intervenes with that messenger on his way down to Ekron. And he says, where are you going? He says, well, Ahaziah's hurt. And he wants me to go inquire of Beelzebub. And he says, is there not a God in Israel that he's sending you all the way down there? You turn around, you go right back in there, and you tell him this is what God says. And so he goes back in, and Ahaziah says, what are you doing here? He says, well, I ran into that man Elijah. And he said, isn't there a God in Israel that you can consult with, that you're sending me all the way down? And whenever he says, well, let me speak to that man. And so Elijah comes in and says, Ahaziah, you're going to die. Sure enough, he did. He tries to intimidate Elijah without success. And when he dies, the fall of the Omride dynasty is almost complete. There is one person that is left. In the meantime, he chooses Elisha to be his successor. And whenever Elisha is with Elijah and he's wandering around, he's following Elijah, and Elijah has prophesied against Syria, and he's prophesied against Ben-Hadad of Samaria and all that sort of stuff. And right at the very end of Elijah's walk on this earth, Elisha is walking with Elijah, and Elijah says, stay here. And Elisha says, no, I'm going with you. So they go a little bit further, and all the prophets say, you know he's going to be taken from you. And he says, no, I'm going with him. And Elijah says, stay here. He says, no, I'm going with you. He parts the Jordan River. They both go across the Jordan River. And then he makes a very unusual request. What was that request?
To be like Elijah was.
He says, may I inherit a double portion? This is back to the birthright. Remember that? The firstborn always got double and everybody else got one. He's saying, I want to be you. I want to be your successor. I want to be the one that is in charge of all the prophets. A request for power and ability, a designation as his true heir. And Elijah said, I cannot guarantee that, but if you're with me when you see me taken away, then God will give it to you. And sure enough, he was there. So Elisha returns, and he comes back across the river. And I make the statement right here, Elisha may not have had quite the same character that Elijah had. Why do I say that? What's the first thing that he really runs into once he's on the west side of the Jordan River? 42 young men. And what are the 42 young men doing? They were mocking him. Go on up, Baldy. Go on up, Baldy. So he called 2 she-bears out of the woods, and they mauled the 42 of them and killed them. Just because he didn't have any hair. As a prophet, Elisha predicted Israelites' victory over Moab. He predicted the end of the Syrian army siege of Samaria. And so he was involved in a little bit of prediction of things of a military nature. He was something of a miracle worker. There are at least 9 different miracles that we read that Elisha performed. He parted the Jordan River. He sweetened bad water. He multiplied the widow's oil and flour. He brought the Shunammite son back to life. He cured poisonous stew. And in all of these situations, we see him helping Israelites that are in need. He fed 100 men. He healed Naaman of leprosy. He caused an axe head to float. He blinded the eyes of Ben-Hadad's army. And even in death, after he had died, he brought someone back to life. He was dead. He was gone. He was in a tomb, in a cave. Another man died, and the people are in a hurry, so they toss the dead man into the cave. His body rolls over, comes into contact with Elisha's bones, and he comes back to life. Elisha was a political activist. He was involved in the tearing down and building up of kings and kingdoms. He was involved in Hazael replacing Ben-Hadad. He anointed Jehu as king over Israel. And Jehu finished doing what he could do to get rid of Baalism. He didn't have any use for Joram, the king of Israel. Joram and Jehoshaphat, the king of Judah, were together, and they were asking him for help. And Elisha looks at Joram and says, I have absolutely no use for you, and I would not give you the time of day. But Jehoshaphat is here, so I'm going to put up with you because of Jehoshaphat. He wept over the fate of Israel, and in chapter 13, Elisha dies. Micaiah. In all of his confrontations with Ahab, Elijah prophesied Ahab would die. What did Micaiah prophesy in chapter 22? Elijah prophesied that Ahab would die, but Micaiah prophesied how he would die in battle, and that Israel would be wandering around. I rushed through the last 2 or 3 of them there. I went back and forth a little bit. I kind of got through Elisha in a real big hurry. At the end of the day, Ahab died. How did Ahab die? He died in battle. He was pierced with an arrow. He said to his chariot driver, get me out of here. And as they were getting out of there, he died. By the time they got back to the capital city, he had already died. His blood had poured out. It had pooled up in the bottom of the chariot. So they hauled off Ahab, and they went and they rinsed out the chariot in the same place where Naboth had died and been stoned to death. And so the dogs literally did lick up Ahab's blood in the same spot that they licked up Naboth's blood. At this point, Jezebel is not dead. She doesn't die until Jehu becomes king. So, were the prophets betraying? Were they guilty of betrayal? Did they betray the kings? Did they betray Ahab and Ahaziah? Or did they revolt?
So they revolted because he was worshiping.
Generally speaking, what do you make of Elijah?
flow. 800 false prophets.
When you're called by God, you're called by God. What else do you make of Elijah?
He was very obedient to God.
Okay.
Did everything he told him.
What else? I see Elijah as obedient to God. I see him very determined to try to get rid of Baal worship. But I also see that he's just a little bit sarcastic. And I see that he got a little depressed. What do we need when we're depressed? There are three things that happened to Elijah when he got depressed and he ran. Three things that God did to take care of him. The first thing that God did was he made sure he got plenty of sleep and he fed him underneath the tree. Second thing that he did was he encouraged him to say, "You're not alone." And the third thing that he did was he gave him fresh purpose. Fresh purpose. There's a lot of words. Despair, discouragement, disdain. That's a different word altogether, but then there is depression. He made mountains out of molehills. He convinced himself it was all over right after he had been at his sarcastic best. Yell a little louder. He's in the bathroom. He can't hear you. What do you make of Elisha?
He was pretty normal. He had his moments of strength and his moments of weakness.
Well, why did he get so upset about being called old baldy?
Must have been a soft one.
At least a couple of ideas. The first idea is he had just received a double portion. He was Elijah's heir apparent. He was now one to be reckoned with. And you're making fun of him? I don't think so. The second idea is really and truly long hair was considered and long beards was considered respectable. Remember that the narrative about where they had their beards shaved off, and they had to go into seclusion until their beards grew back. And so the idea here is that maybe they were making fun of the fact that he wasn't a respectable kind of person. And this is right after he had been anointed. And I am now Elisha. How dare you speak to me that way? What do you make of Ahab and Jezebel?
I think that Ahab was a little wimpy sometimes.
Okay, I won't argue with you there. All the real conflict seems to be more Elijah and Jezebel, or Jezebel behind whatever Ahab is saying. What else do you make of them?
Jezebel was totally evil. She was totally,
She just didn't care
who she hurt or what she did to anybody. She just had no fear because she was a king's wife.
And a king's daughter. And she dies in a rather gruesome kind of death because she gets chunked down. And Jehu goes in, he eats lunch, and then he says, well, maybe somebody ought to go pick her up. After all, she is a king's daughter. And when they went out to pick her up, they realized that the dogs had already been there and the horses had already been there, and all they found were her skull and her hands. He says, oh, well. Is that the last we hear of Jezebel? Well, we'll find out later on. She had a daughter by the name of Athaliah. Comments, questions, further concerns? Well, if you have some, I'll be happy to answer them. Father, we see a man of God being sarcastic and being depressed, and you still worked with him and in him and through him, and you took him up to heaven. He didn't die. I guess it gives hope for all of us that are sarcastic. I don't know. You also worked through Elisha, and you changed nations, and you changed kings, and you brought people back to life, although he seemed to be a little prickly about his hair. And Father, those who rejected you, the Ahabs and the Jezebels, rather ignominious ends. Father, help us learn from this, to be faithful, to understand. Elijah and Elisha were just doing what they could for the good of the people. Help us do what we can for the good of Alamogordo. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.